Good morning. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here. I've been here at the Wilson Center for almost 24 years now. Woohoo! Next year we'll have my quarter century celebration. So the China Environment Forum, in its 26 years of existence, has focused quite heavily on U.S.-China climate relationships. You could even say it's kind of the DNA of our project. And so I'm particularly happy today that we're talking about U.S.-China climate. It's been seems like on hold for a while because of various tension in the relationship. But I think that a lot of people in my network and those of you who watch China energy, you know that no country in the world releases no more greenhouse gases than China. And in many ways, it looks like there's no other country that has the greater capacity and ambition to mitigate climate change. I mean, over the years, since I've had kind of a front row seat with Joanna and many of my commentators here today, looking at the policies, the investments that they've been making, we've seen that a lot of that seems to have been kind of triggered or encouraged by international partnerships, particularly with the United States. So, I already mentioned, someone really sitting on the front row, do I say for 20 years, Joanna?
Been more, but yeah.
20 plus years, Joanna Lewis from Georgetown University. She's a Provost Distinguished Associate Professor at the Energy and Environment and Director of the Science, Technology, and International Affairs Program at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Well, Joanna, for these 20 plus years, you've been laser focused on tracking U.S.-China energy and climate relationships. And despite the growing tensions over the past few years, the U.S. climate envoy with his Chinese counterpart have continued to say that, we need to work together on climate for the planet. And just this weekend, you guys probably paid attention that Secretary Blinken was in China meeting with his counterparts and Xi Jinping, and the issue of climate came up as one of the areas where the two countries should continue conversations. So we are continuing that conversation here. So drawing on her new book, Cooperating for the Climate, Learning from International Partnerships in China's Clean Energy Sector, Joanna's going to today talk about her analysis of international clean energy partnerships with China, the path forward for China in clean energy development, and what it means for global governance, and even maybe bilateral relationships with the U.S. Is it going to be our lifeline maybe? Who knows? After she's done giving her presentation, we're going to have two commentators. We've got Erica Thomas, who's the Director of Policy, Environment, Sustainability, and Regulatory at the Information Technology Industry Council. I almost had to take a second breath for that title, ma'am. It's okay. She's going to give her insights on the book, drawing on her years of experience, not only working with clean energy and innovative industries, but also her experience in overseeing U.S.-China science and technology cooperation when she was in the EST, when she served as EST counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. Next, we have Shuang Liu, who is the China Finance Director at World Resources Institute. She's going to provide some other takeaways from the book, making connections to her work on sustainable finance at WRI, and also years of experience on climate mitigation work in China, both at the Energy Foundation and at Greenpeace. So, short and sweet introductions. Thank you for all of you in the room and those of you who tuned in online. And Joanna, the floor, virtual and live, is yours.
Turn this on. Great, thank you so much, Jennifer. It's always so great to be back here. It's been many years, I think, at this point, and of course, great to see everyone in person, and thanks everyone for joining online as well. I was going to just talk a little bit about the book itself, but would love to kind of keep this informal and open this up for conversation, so we'll leave plenty of time for that. So this book was really motivated by a few key framing questions. Really, I wanted to understand how countries have been cooperating with China on clean energy and climate change over the past 3 decades or so. How countries manage the benefits and the risks of such collaboration, because of course there are both, and we see sort of different agreements, and different countries address this in different ways, but we've never really looked at this systematically before. And then of course, we are in I'll say an interesting period of U.S.-China relations. Sitting here in Washington, this book is not just about the United States. This book I intentionally made this a much broader analysis than just the China-U.S. relationship, because the China-U.S. relationship is, of course, quite pivotal, quite central to a lot of what happens globally. But it's not the only relationship, and particularly in the energy and climate space, there are many countries that have been working with China also for decades and taking different approaches. I think it's important that everyone learns from each other's experiences and that we look at this in a broader context. So the book does look much more broadly than the U.S. and China. But of course, today, particularly with Secretary Blinken just finishing his trip to Beijing, I think it is important to try to take these sort of lessons learned and think about how we can learn from our past cooperation to inform decisions about bilateral cooperation going forward. So I sort of see the key contributions of this book, namely, first of all, the data that was collected in this book. This book took many years to really pull together, and part of that was I had a team of research assistants working with me over the past 10 years or so, pulling together a database showing how countries are engaging with China bilaterally. We compiled a database of 434 agreements, including 43 different countries and the EU. I don't claim that this is, perfectly comprehensive. It's actually quite difficult to find this information in a systematic way, because there's sort of no one place where this is archived. Different governments track this in different ways. Databases sort of come and go and have sort of different comprehensiveness. So anyway, this was sort of our attempt to pull together the first database of bilateral climate and energy partnerships with China, and I hope that will be useful for other researchers. And then in addition to the database itself, the book details 3 specific case studies that look at cooperation with China in depth. And I chose to look at 3 different clean energy research centers. One that was the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, which many of you may know about, but then also 2 other clean energy research centers, one between China and Brazil and one between China and Denmark, the Danish government. They all sort of, have similar focuses, but different methods of implementation, different strategies, so they make for sort of very interesting cross-case comparison. And then, this is an academic book, right? I'm a professor, so there's the sort of academic side of this book beyond the practical is to really propose an integrated framework that combines the political, economic, and technical factors that I think can explain the rationale for and the structure of cooperation mechanisms. And also, as someone who studies innovation of specific clean energy technologies, I think it's very interesting to look at how these partnerships have been used to leverage particularly cross-border clean energy research and development, as well as demonstration deployment, and different models for how countries have leveraged sort of China in their own innovation systems. And then finally, the book also maps international cooperation with China across different clean energy technologies. And I'll talk a bit about this. We can sort of see innovation trajectories of technologies by looking at which countries are engaged on which technologies. China is, of course, central to almost all clean energy technologies in terms of market share, and increasingly in terms of innovation as well. So we can sort of look at the global picture of how different countries are engaging with China across the set of technologies to try to understand sort of future innovation trajectories. So when you look at total bilateral clean energy and climate agreements with China, over the last 3 decades, not surprisingly, there have been more and more, right? This is sort of showing the cumulative focus on this area. And again, this is all countries cooperating with China over the last 3 decades. So essentially exponential growth, but then a sort of a petering off over the last few years. A lot of that sort of driven by U.S. dynamics, as I'll talk about, which tends to have the largest number of agreements. And I won't go through this in detail now, but in the book, I put together a variety of figures based on the database, which I mentioned, which looks, for example, at which countries are most involved in which clean energy technology areas. Which countries are working on smart grid technologies, which countries are working on carbon capture utilization and storage. And so you can sort of look again for these trends over time and different focus areas. In the book, I sort of categorize all the agreements by clean energy technology as well as by mode of cooperation, which I'll talk about in a moment. This is just another way of looking at technology focus by country again. So you can see, most countries that do bilateral cooperation with China in this space have quite a diverse range of clean energy technologies that they are engaged in. But some, with a sort of more focus in specific areas. And then, of course, this also changes over time, so you can look at this from a time series perspective as well. I mentioned that beyond technology focus, I also look at the mode of cooperation, and by this I mean I sort of separate, I code all the agreements by sort of three distinct modes. The first being modes like cooperation that are primarily focused on commercial opportunities, so looking for business opportunities, market access. The second is agreements that are focused primarily on dialogue and information sharing. These tend to be the more high-level agreements that are more symbolic, but often quite important. And then finally, agreements that are more focused on the sort of research development demonstration side of technology, and doing this in some sort of joint way in partnership with China. So again, different countries focus on these different modes of cooperation, and this, of course, changes over time. This is a chart showing in the cumulative over 3 decades. And then, of course, when you look across time periods, you see shifts in how cooperation happens. And as we know here, the U.S. and China in particular, we see sort of up times and down times in bilateral cooperation, particularly in the climate and energy space. Thinking back to the sort of 2009 when President Obama first came into office, we saw a record number of bilateral agreements specifically on climate change and energy signed between our two countries. And then there were sort of a few years of implementation. There was another uptick around Paris, when there was sort of another focus on this. And then, of course, you see the sort of downturn during, like, the Trump administration, for example. The Bush administration, there was a fair amount of U.S.-China cooperation, but not, sort of the record levels we saw during the Obama administration. So, of course, there are, a lot of this is driven by domestic political priorities, and those vary country to country, right? And so that will sort of cause these shifts in how much focus there is on bilateral cooperation with China. So I mentioned the other thing I do in the book is sort of dive into 3 specific clean energy research centers. The first being the CERC, which was really this flagship initiative of the Obama administration, but it actually spanned both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and really focused on, it was a virtual center, but involved hundreds of researchers from both countries, and focused on multiple technology areas. It set up consortia across both countries involving universities, national labs, and was really focused on joint research development demonstration as well as policy exchange, modeling, a whole variety of activities. It was really quite an ambitious program. The second is the China National Renewable Energy Center, or CNREC, which is really the flagship of Denmark's engagement within China. Sort of came out of many years of cooperation between the Danish government and the Chinese government on renewable energy in particular. And CNREC is a really interesting model, I think, of bilateral engagement, because if you're familiar with this was actually a think tank sort of focused on renewable energy policy analysis and modeling embedded within the Energy Research Center, which is the kind of main energy analysis think tank embedded within the National Development Reform Commission of China, helping to advise the Chinese government doing analysis on energy policy related research. And so the Danish government sort of helped to build capacity within this center, that with a goal of trying to directly inform renewable energy and related policy within China. And then the third center is this China-Brazil Center for Climate Change and Energy Technology Innovation, or the China-Brazil Center. And these latter 2 centers, I think, are really not very well studied in the literature, the CERC a little bit, but these are really just quite novel and I think important to document sort of their experience and the model of bilateral cooperation, what we learned from them. So the China-Brazil Center was a partnership between one of Brazil's leading research universities in Rio and in Tsinghua University. There was a center set up within Tsinghua to focus specifically on climate change and clean energy technology innovation. And what was unique about this partnership, so it was set up by the government, but essentially implemented at the research level. And you saw you saw really interesting collaborations in the RD&D space take place, where you actually had, for example, biofuels technology was a big focus of this, not surprisingly given Brazil's real preeminence in this area. There was a novel biofuel technology developed by professors at Tsinghua that they sort of knew was maybe going to have less application immediately within the Chinese market, but had commercial potential in Brazil. They demonstrated this technology at several projects in Brazil, and then were able to sort of scale and commercialize, patent this technology, bring it back to sell in both countries. So, kind of this really interesting cross-border innovation model facilitated by a government-to-government bilateral partnership. So, in the book, as I mentioned, I try to sort of bring this analytic framework to assess the political and technological benefits of cooperation. I just came out of, I've been in 2 U.S.-China climate dialogues over the last few weeks, sort of track 2 dialogues, and we spent a lot of time talking about sort of what might be feasible, right, going forward. And then there's sort of what's technically feasible and what's politically feasible, right? And these are not always the same thing. There's sort of what both our countries need to do to mitigate climate change, which technologies we really need to focus on, things like CCS or things, these technologies that may not ever sort of make it to commercial scale without large-scale investments and deployment by China and the United States. Both still use quite a bit of coal. But then there's sort of the political sensitivities to certain technologies, particularly pre-commercial technologies that may have more IP value and other issues, right? So I think it's sort of important to look at these separately, but sort of, in the context of how we think about cooperation. So, very sort of loosely, if we were to place the 3 clean energy research centers I just discussed on this continuum, you see the China-Brazil Center, for example, this really novel partnership model, but, focused on relatively small-scale technologies, relatively niche, lower-risk technologies, and lower political stakes overall in this partnership, just sort of due to the China-Brazil relationship being important, but particularly as climate change sort of became less central in the Brazilian political system during the time of this partnership, you saw sort of some pulling back by Brazil on this, and then China sort of turning to other partnerships. That may change, of course, with the new Brazilian president, who's put much more focus on climate change. And then the CNREC, the Danish program, I'd say I'd put somewhere in the middle, of having sort of, relatively good political benefit, good technological benefit, but not the kind of the high stakes presidential level focus that we saw, for example, in the U.S.-China CERC, where we saw both presidents signing agreements, we saw both ministers involved, and this was really a partnership that was used to leverage a lot of what was happening even at the working level within the U.S.-China clean energy relationship. This was, I forgot to mention, this is a public-private partnership, so many companies were involved in this agreement, and I documented several examples of U.S. companies, for example, who had partnerships or joint ventures with Chinese companies under the CERC umbrella that were able to leverage the agreement to work out disputes and sort of issues they might have had with their Chinese partners in a commercial way, sort of by the political coverage that this agreement gave to their actions in China. And I see this as very constructive, right? It's sort of a way that that a high-level political signal is extremely important for sort of what happens at the working level. I think we're seeing that today, where when we sort of have the absence of a high-level political signal that climate change is important for the U.S. and China to work on, for example, that it does sort of stall things at the working level, even if there's much less sort of political sensitivity at that level. So just very briefly, from an innovation perspective, we think about sort of different activities that take place within these partnerships and, how they sort of map along what we call the research and development, demonstration, deployment continuum. This is sort of the linear but, iterative way of thinking about innovation, not the only way, but you can sort of take this and map this to specific projects that were implemented under the U.S.-China CIRC, under the Brazil Center, for example, and you can kind of look at these, again, changing global models of joint innovation. So for example, under the CIRC, you would have some innovations that were developed in the United States, that's the blue, demonstrated in China, and then deployed in both countries. The goal of the CIRC, though, was to have this sort of joint R&D, sort of a jointly developed technology that would then be demonstrated, deployed in both countries. There were sort of minimal examples of where that actually worked out, a couple cases, but not as much as I think both governments would have liked to see. And then, of course, now this sort of seems even more difficult to envision doing given broader technology sensitivities. The China-Brazil Center, as I mentioned, you saw Chinese innovation sort of demonstrated in Brazil and then brought back to be deployed in both countries. And so lastly, just in terms of the analysis in the book, I mentioned mapping international cooperation with China across different clean energy technologies. So if you can read this slide, you can see that sort of on the left column, I sort of point out all the different clean energy technologies or groupings that we analyze in the book, and then a few of the key countries that are involved in bilateral cooperation and sort of where the strong focus is versus sort of minimal or moderate focus. Which again helps us sort of think systematically, when you look at these global programs or multilateral programs like Mission Innovation, for example, where the goal of these partnerships is to have countries come together and sort of take active roles in almost sort of sharing the load in how we're going to think about financing clean energy innovation going forward and bring the key climate technologies that we need, to decarbonize our energy systems to light. And so this sort of gives you a sense of if China's sort of central in all these technologies, where these sort of different countries are leveraging China's engagement in the clean energy technologies that they see as priorities going forward. So to wrap up, just a few kind of key findings from the book. It's not surprising, the book is about China because China has been the primary target of international clean energy cooperation over the past few decades. I do think this will start to shift, right? I think China was sort of the key bilateral partner in the climate and energy space with most countries until very recently. This is starting to change, partly with political and economic tensions increasing, but also as other sort of emerging developing countries sort of become more engaged in this space and as their emissions grow. As I show, you see this sort of continuum political and technological benefit that varies across countries, which can sort of give us some ways to think more critically about bilateral cooperation and how we should leverage it for different means. We do see, I see there's less cooperation in certain clean energy technology areas that are key for the low carbon transition, driven primarily by competitiveness concerns. So I think this is something to think about. As I mentioned, there are sort of a few key technologies we all are going to need, but are harder maybe to cooperate on internationally. So I think we need to think about how we can do this if we're going to need these technologies deployed soon at scale. One thing I try to do in this book also is to really measure tangible outcomes from cooperation efforts, right? I get asked all the time, as I'm sure many of you do, why should we cooperate with China? What is the value of these bilateral partnerships? What do they actually achieve? And I do, it's particularly in the 3 case studies, show some metrics that actually help to measure the outputs of such cooperation, which is easier to do when you have agreements that involve these sort of multi-year, multi-stakeholder investment. When you have a kind of a one-off, MOU, it's much harder to then sort of measure the impact of that over time, compared with something like the U.S.-China CIRC. I think it's important to note that when I started researching these bilateral partnerships, a lot of these were really unilateral, like where you had sort of technology and know-how flowing to China. Let's help China with capacity building, right? That's sort of why a lot of these countries got involved in the 80s and 90s, right, and early 2000s with these bilateral agreements. But this has really shifted, and I think that's just very important for us to acknowledge that you can't design partnerships in the same way you did, 20 years ago, because China is leading, in many of these technologies now. It's not about about showing China how to do things right. It's how we can learn from China's experience, particularly in deploying a lot of these clean energy technologies at scale. And this has, really, I think, part of what's changed kind of the competitiveness calculation and the dynamic for this engagement. So just to wrap up, and to bring this back to a sort of a Washington audience, I think, I still believe clean energy cooperation is a crucial component of the climate response. This is not something that we can all sort of do alone. And engagement has led to important changes in, both the global response to climate change as well as in domestic climate and energy policy. And engagement with China, I think, overall has been quite constructive. Fruitful cooperation with China is indeed still possible, I think, and in the U.S. national interest if it's designed to optimize political and technological benefit. And again, I think there are ways that we can do this, particularly if we build on lessons learned from past experience. We need to look at cooperation mechanisms that leverage our complementarities between the two countries, do not dismiss risks, but rather look for ways to address them head on. We know how to design mechanisms for shifting geopolitical environments, so economic and security concerns should not be a reason to just not engage at all. I think we just have to engage in a way that reflects the new world that we live in and takes into account how to manage these risks. So I will stop there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we get some applause for this woman? She wrote a big book. But also like your database. And I was just, one little quick side. Can people find this database?
Yes. So yes, thank you. There's a link in the book, and I'm happy to send the link to anyone if you shoot me an email. But yes, it's publicly available for download.
I just wanted to make sure because that kind of,
Yes.
I'm sure a lot of people in the room that are nerdy like data. All right, so let's ask. How about Erica? Can you kick us off with some of your reflections on the book or things that her presentation made you think of? Go to town.
All right, well, first of all, thank you for,
Pull the mic a little closer.
okay. All right, well, first, thank you for inviting me here today. It's really almost strange to do something in person and see people that you haven't seen in so long. So it's an honor to be here with all these great people on the panel and get to talk about this really exciting book. So I thought the book was incredibly interesting and insightful. For me, it was really a walk down memory lane because there were just so many stories, right, that it brought back of past times. So I'm going to focus a bit on, my experiences when I was really focusing on the U.S.-China relationship, and then and how this book kind of clarified for me why it was such an amazing time when I was really focused on these areas of cooperation. There was so much cooperation, and then why things have changed so much since then. So for context, I was the Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Counselor, as Jennifer said, in Beijing from 2010 to 2014. And I was also in China looking at S&T issues in a prior tour in the economic section at the U.S. Embassy from 2006 to 2008. And then in between those two tours, I actually ran the first U.S.-China Strategic Economic Dialogue under the Obama administration. And my personal interest was in these areas. So when I was working on that joint statement, and you saw that big spike in all of the, in your graph, of all of the agreements under the Obama administration, I was at the desk pushing all those, working with partners across the government to make it happen, and you could make it happen, right? So it was just incredible times. And actually, just to put, how good was it? Well, during those times, I would marvel at how science and technology cooperation could transcend politics. And at that point, I would look back, and despite the ups and downs in the political and economic relationship, the S&T cooperation seemed like it was, you couldn't, stop it. Well, things have changed. Anyway, but just how good was it? So as hard as it might be to imagine today, I found an old speech of mine from that time. And I stated in that speech, quote, I like to brag that I have the world's best job. I work on issues that are arguably the backbone of the US-China relationship. And why I say this is because this is back in 2010. Why I say this is that the bilateral agreement on S&T was the first official agreement signed after normalization of relations between the US and China in 1979. And then over the 30 years since that agreement, the cooperation had branched into hundreds of agreements between 25 technical agencies on the US side and their counterparts on the Chinese side. And I wasn't the only one who had that view. Others who were working in that space, I think, shared that view. And it was even stated in the State Department's 2006 biennial report to the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which stated, again, quote, the S&T agreement has withstood the test of political turmoil and has provided a stabilizing influence on US-Sino relations, end quote. So unfortunately, now when I look back at the time when I was working on US-China environment, science, climate, energy cooperation, it feels like the distance between then and now is in the Star Wars realm of like a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And Joanna, I think your book does a lot to kind of explain why and that things have changed so much by looking at what the contexts were for those relationships and why back then it seemed like unstoppable, but today it seems almost impossible in many to fix. So first of all, let me say that where we are today and where we feel like it's impossible to make progress is really terrifying because how are we going to avoid the dire consequences of climate change if the world's two largest emitters of greenhouse gases can't figure out a way to work together to ensure that the global climate ambition is strong enough to meet the Paris Agreement climate goals of limiting warming to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So, as you point out in the book, energy and climate cooperation is rarely compartmentalized, and strains to larger political and economic relationship can have direct implications for the success of any climate and energy cooperative effort. And now you see this, yes, it no longer can be compartmentalized like it used to be. And this is despite, we know this is the case because I will say anybody who's worked with U.S. climate envoy Kerry, I mean, he was U.S. Secretary of State and is now the U.S. climate envoy. This is a person who is personally, completely dedicated to this issue. Yet, despite his absolute best efforts to try to keep this issue compartmentalized from the broader bilateral tensions, just a few months back, he is quoted as saying, regrettably, in the last year, what was not supposed to happen has happened, which is the climate issue has gotten mixed up into all the other tensions that exist between our countries. So your book provides the historical context and timeline of the changing nature of U.S. and China relations. You describe the model used between the U.S. and China for the first several decades, and then you talk about how those models have shifted in the last 15 years. And by doing so, you shed light on why we were able to cooperate with China for 30 plus years, and then now we no longer feel like we can. So for the first 3 decades of our cooperation, as you showed in some of your slides there, we operated under what you called the traditional model or the north-south model, where clean energy technological innovations from the industrialized countries were transferred to the developed countries. or the South, as we were calling then. And then you detail how over time, China's knowledge base and innovative capacities have developed significantly. And so that by about 2009, China began cooperating with the US and other countries on a more equal footing. And you call that new model of cooperation either the new model, and you describe also it as the future models, right, where research and development and deployment was more dynamic and bidirectional. So my takeaway that it's precisely because of this shift in that dynamic, and I think you explain this, is that in the traditional model, I guess there was a lot of feeling of control and I guess less risk from the US side. And I even remember when I was working on S&T agreements back then, and the way we had drafted the original S&T agreement with China was all about IPR in China, US IPR going to China. There was literally nothing written about what you do when IPR was developed jointly or developed in China and coming to the US. So the entire dynamic changed because we didn't even, it's as if the drafters didn't even see a world shifting, that it might not always be the US providing technology to someone else, that actually somebody else might be. And that wasn't just with China. That was IPR in the US S&T agreements was kind of like worldwide, where we didn't think anybody else was going to be the developers. It was always going to be the US providing. And you're describing this, I think, says why it no longer is so easy, because the US needs to shift the way that we're operating, and I think all of the many different examples you gave in your book provide context for, all right, and this, the US-China CERC was a great one, because even that agreement, when it started, didn't have IPR addressed in it. But I think one of the reasons it became so successful is because early on, they were realizing they were missing the IPR stuff, and a lot of attention came into, well, how do we fix this? And then there was an entire IPR structure that was put in place, which you described, and that enabled that to last as long as it did, even, although most people don't realize it, not through some of the Trump administration, some of that cooperation was able to continue despite the politics. So I think it would be, I guess, hopeful that policymakers look at your book and look at those examples, because I don't know how we can manage to address the existential issue of our day without figuring out a way of the two largest emitters working together. So I just wanted to thank you for all that you put into your book, and it really resonated for me, in addition to bringing back incredible positive memories, because it makes me so sad where things are today, and hope we can find another way back there. And maybe this trip last weekend, right? Like, you know, I was looking, believe me, last night I was telling Joanna this morning, like, okay, when they get back, where's climate? I mean, I see it was mentioned, right? But I haven't been able to dig into the details of, you know, will this be an opportunity to turn around discussions there? Because I know there's a will, and hopefully on both sides. So.
Thank you for those comments. And I want to note that when I give talks about that time period, I give a lot of talks on U.S.-China relations and climate. You guys remember the movie Forrest Gump? I have a GIF of Forrest Gump playing ping pong, and I have that on top, ping ponging, and I call it like climate ping pong, clean energy ping pong, and I list all the different things, because it really was, I was so dang busy at that time.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? Like it was unbelievable. I mean, I think an assistant secretary at least level, if not higher, every single week from one of those 25 technical cooperations agreements. It was, and at one point in the S&D, you know, the strategic and economic dialogue, I think in 2012, I had 72 officials on that we had to manage. And I had to call in help from Washington, and I had to call in help from like our various consulates and even some other embassies to help staff how many high-level people were coming just to talk on environment and climate and energy. So it's just, yeah, it was Star Wars, yeah.
I mean, one thing that, and maybe I might have Joanna maybe make a couple of responses maybe to what she said, but also maybe you didn't mention explicitly, but the State Department's working group, the U.S.-China working group on climate, that those guys, because we all knew them, it was blood, sweat, and tears, man. They were, and I'm sure their Chinese counterparts were the same, so that, like when the U.S.-China climate agreement came, there was a lot of surprise. Oh, the U.S. and China? And we were like, people that were watching, like, yeah, we pulled it out. But yeah, so Joanna, do you want to make any quick comments to anything that Erica brought up, so you don't forget, or you're good? You'll keep going?
Later, yeah,
Okay,
sorry.
all right then, Liu Shuang. And Liu Shuang, can you pull your mic closer to you? And then don't move it after you push it. There you go.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks for inviting me, and it's such a great pleasure and trying to remember what the good old days were. I think, Joanna, thank you for doing such a fantastic job, not just to remind us what the memories were, but also taking those examples, what might look ahead of us if we're trying to stay optimistic, and thank you for inspiring us. Maybe what I will start is probably by building upon what Erica was sharing on the traditional model shifting from the new model, as Joanna you have articulated in your book. I have seen how this has also changed instead of the North to South, and also the South-South collaboration. Very clearly demonstrated is in the clean energy manufacturing capacity. What we have seen is that many of even the private renewable energy manufacturers in China have already started building up their manufacturing capacity abroad, namely in Southeast Asia and many Asia countries. There are several factors, of course, behind why this shift has happened. But what we have seen is, for instance, Goldwind, which is one of the largest wind manufacturer in China, has started their manufacturing capacity in Pakistan and looking at the domestic market in Pakistan. Jinko, which is one of the largest private solar PV manufacturer, has already started its capacity in Malaysia, Philippines, and potentially many other Southeast Asian countries too. I think the factors I have seen is, firstly, because China can offer relatively cheap and also good quality technologies to those southern countries, which is very much needed. Secondly, it is also that increasing demand and requirement on local content coming from the host countries in Asia and maybe other countries definitely define a pulling factor for those locally manufactured or assembled capacity that's introduced from China. Thirdly, it is also because of the trade policy by US and EU actually created an incentive for the Chinese manufacturers to create space so that it can go around and still have a place to export to the EU and US market. And it's a mix of everything, but it's very interesting to look at how the different dynamics from different parts created something actually can be very much beneficial to the global South on both technology and even potentially that the cost can actually also reduce by having those locally manufactured. So also building upon this, I also want to compliment Joanna's great efforts, also looking at the policies and some of those even beyond climate policies, how the U.S.-China collaboration and of course the collaboration between beyond U.S. and China has been. And this is two examples I want to share based on my own experiences working on those issues in over the years. For instance, Joanna, you have successfully demonstrated example of how the bilateral collaboration and also some part of the multilateral collaboration can be. One example I do want to highlight is the fossil fuel subsidy reform discussion between US and China. I think that's a very nice example of how the bilateral cooperation between US and China has happened under a multilateral framework and can be used to actually push for even more collaboration, and that can be replicated under the multilateral framework. This is back in 2013, the US and China have agreed to work on the first peer review of fossil fuel subsidy reform under the G20 framework. And that was, of course, at the time that US and China had more, it's easier for the two countries to work on it. And throughout the process, there were tons of rounds of discussions, both on technical and political level, on what that fossil fuel subsidy review should look like. I do want to highlight this is actually under G20 framework. It was not under any environmental and climate working group. It is under the working group focusing on the financing issue and under the financial ministry. Even though it is not climate oriented, it has significant implication on the climate and energy issue we're talking about today. And in 2016, the two countries released the final results of the peer review on inefficient fossil fuel reform. The way it works that each of the countries has published their self-report looking at, here's a list of the inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, and did their best trying to quantify like what's the estimated costs and level of fossil fuel subsidies, and also provided a list of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that the two countries want to reform. And building upon it, each of the countries has also reviewed the self-report draft that they have prepared and giving recommendations and the discussions, which is a very innovative model under the G20. And this is also followed by the other peer reviews building upon how that the two countries between US and China have been able to test how the methodology as well as the practices can be on fossil fuel subsidy reform. So this is the first example, and I do think, and at the time and still nowadays, this is a very inspiring one just to show how this can work out. The second example I'd like to share is on the carbon pricing one, or the carbon market, to be more specific. And that's where I have seen the collaboration between US and China, and this is definitely way beyond the US and China, have worked out on actually a national carbon market in China, which is probably the largest one in terms of the scale and coverage. This is beyond US and China because also in my previous experiences, it's tons of collaboration between US and China, EU and China, and also international organizations, including World Bank and UNEP and the other member states in EU and China. And we're also looking at a different model that's not just only focusing on the federal and national government collaboration between US and China and EU and China, but also heavily rooted in the collaboration between the subnational governments in China. For instance, China started the carbon market pilot on the subnational level, and that's where a lot of discussion and exchanges were happening between California carbon market, the regulators there, and also the regional greenhouse, the RGGI, the regional greenhouse gas initiative. That's the regional carbon market in the northeast part of the U.S. And as far as I know, I don't know any single pilot on carbon market in China that hasn't been talking to the policymakers and their advisors in the US that's active on those two markets. And that's the same case with those policymakers in China and their counterparts in the EU and basically any of the active carbon market in China. I think that we wouldn't get the carbon market like it was nowadays without this collaboration and exchanges between China and the rest of the world on those experiences. This is certainly something that we have seen on technical level. All the key components of carbon market design on the cap setting, on the MRV, and also on all the components, we've seen the discussion. It is also what we have seen on I think that's where the collaboration is actually both ways, as Joanna has articulated in her book. As we have seen that some of the legal challenges faced by many carbon markets, I think, for instance, in the US and China, it is how the two sides can probably learn from each other on how to have a more sound and a legal base for the carbon markets to be more active in both of the countries. That's where I see that some of the future collaboration can be potentially built upon the experiences and good beliefs and practices that we were able to achieve in the past or past year, I think.
That was excellent. I'm so glad you told the story of California. I actually just had a meeting recently, a webinar called Reining in the Methane Hoof Print of California Cows, because in the ag sector, that they're the big source of methane, and was speaking with the same kind of people at the California Air Resources Board who in the past had worked with China on electric vehicles, and so it's just, yeah, those kind of, those linkages, I don't know, they haven't been expanded recently, but I'll hold off a second. So Joanna, do you want any responses to their comments?
Sure. I mean, thank you both, first of all, for your reflections and your own experiences. I mean, I've learned a lot from both of you over the years, so I really appreciate your being here. Just a quick reaction, first to what Erica said about the CERC IP agreement. I think this is, again, a really interesting case of where, we were able to sort of respond to an obstacle that was hindering effective cooperation by, it was sort of realized that we had this vision of doing this sort of, joint R&D based U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center, but that the IP issues were really causing a lot of the companies in particular, but also the researchers were sort of concerned about joining this unless that was just made a little more clear, kind of what the rules of the road were going to be. And this is something I got to work on very closely with the U.S. Department of Energy and many IP lawyers who were brought in from all over the world, from Hong Kong, China, the U.S., to advise on how we might move forward. And, this whole sort of consortium was set up just to deal with the intellectual property piece of the CERC, and technology management plans were signed among all the participants of all the different consortia. And it was just so novel at the time. I mean, people from the rest of the world were watching this. I don't know if people sort of understand that how sort of new a model this was for how you manage IP in any kind of international partnership. And, this is, for example, in the climate negotiations, the UN climate negotiations under the UNFCCC, for years, right, tech transfer discussions have sort of been held up by IP concerns, because this is sort of it's been a very difficult forum. How do you address IP with 198 countries and when they're not the ones who necessarily own it? But, the CERC really just took this approach, I think, that was, rather than sort of reinventing the wheel, to clarify sort of what the rules would be, how U.S. IP law, Chinese IP law differed, and sort of clarifying that, and then sort of setting ground rules again for background IP coming into the partnership, which I think was just very constructive again. And even though the CERC hasn't continued, I do think that there are just these lessons learned. Not just from the IP arrangement, but just how we deal with like sticky issues and political, economic and politically sensitive issues that can make cooperation challenging. And so, a lot of innovation and sort of novel thinking went into that I think just again shows how we can overcome that. And then, I think like Shuang made a really interesting point about bilateral engagement under multilateral framework. And this is something I do talk about in the book, how important that can be and sort of the back and forth between the multilateral and the bilateral, particularly, vis-a-vis US and China in the climate space. I think without the bilateral engagement that we saw, from the start of the U.S.-China Climate Change Working Group in 2013, leading up to the 2014 joint statement and the 2015 Paris Agreement, I think it's just clear that sort of trust building and direct high level engagement made it possible for Paris to not be Copenhagen, essentially, and again, sort of seeing this play out on the ground, I think it was just so important that you had this open line of communication between both countries. It's not that China and the U.S. agree on everything in the UNFCCC. We're still very far from that. But it just allowed, there was actually language negotiated in the 2014 joint statement that made its way into the Paris Agreement, right? And this is just an example of where it kind of coming to that agreement first bilaterally, then multilaterally, whether it's the G20 or other forums, I think is so valuable. And I think finance is sort of the next big area where there's so much more we could be doing bilaterally, but in this multilateral framing. I had a recent paper looking at how the U.S. and China could be engaging more on overseas renewable energy investments. China, of course, plays a huge role in shaping energy infrastructure investments across the developing world. The United States, I think, could be doing more to engage with China on sort of how they can both sort of make sure that these countries are able to meet their climate goals through clean energy investments. And I think that's related to conversations that are starting to happen on clean energy supply chain diversification and sort of what that means for our ability to, again, achieve global climate goals in the sort of very short time frame that we have, right? We are very reliant on China for many of our clean energy supply chain components. This is obviously causing the U.S. to sort of look into, how through a resurgence in green industrial policy tools can encourage manufacturing at home. So in terms of nostalgia, this brings me back to like the prequel to this book, my first book, which looked at the development of the wind power industry, which you alluded to with Goldwind, and how really, China was in part very successful at building out their clean energy technology industries because they were able to capture the local economic value through these industrial policies that provided economic benefit, green jobs, right? And now other countries are trying to do this, but hopefully we can figure out a way to do it in a way that's not just purely protectionist, but but can sort of maintain access to technologies that are affordable and think about sort of how developing countries, other emerging economies can benefit from the local economic development benefits of these technologies, not just be reliant, on imports.
On that note, I'll ask one question, then I'm going to open up to you guys. And Liu Shuang, I'm going to jump onto this as well with Joanna. Since you're the wind queen, right? You did so much on wind in the past. So she mentioned that that China is this new model is that China's starting to build clean energy manufacturing in places like Pakistan. Is there two things? One is this just China is it going to be building also? Do you think it'll help build local capacity to help, like for example, Pakistan to build their own ability to be part of the supply chain? And second question is there a role for the U.S.? Do we just have to compete with them with this, or is there a complementary role? And I think it's for you and Liu Shuang.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, actually, when we've looked at this, including in the solar industry space, you actually see, so China they're all over the world now, right, in terms of their sales offices, manufacturing facilities in wind, solar, and other clean energy technologies in, many different countries. But we don't see a huge amount of sort of capacity building and sort of knowledge transfer to accompany the sort of the hardware transfer or the, just the sort of export model, sort of sales. I think that's not true across the board, but that's sort of what we found, at least sort of broad-based in solar. And wind is, I think it's essentially the same, although again, there's sort of different incentives in different domestic contexts that do change that. Even Goldwind, when they came to the U.S., it was very much hiring a U.S. team, hiring U.S. staff, so there are ways that they're trying to sort of build local capacity in different countries or responding to different political signals of sort of what is required in terms of incorporating local knowledge and local workers. But I think this is just a place where there's so much opportunity for Chinese clean energy firms to play a more active role in capacity building in the developing world, especially as there's pressure to diversify supply chains. I think this is actually a smart strategy for them to do so. And your second question was about,
What was my second question?
no, I forget.
About what's the U.S.
Oh, what should the U.S.
Is this,
do,
I
right?
mean, because it's often in D.C., in case you guys didn't get the news flash, the general consensus in D.C., China's bad, right? There's a lot of negativity around town. But is there a role for the U.S. in this? It's a big world and there's a lot of demand for clean energy, but just hypothetically speaking.
Yeah, I think the IRA is exciting. It's great, right? It's very important for a variety of reasons for the United States to be building its capacity in a lot of the clean energy technologies we're going to need going forward. It's important to bring along key political constituencies, right, in key states. And I think U.S. Knowledge can help push innovation, right, in some key areas. But that said, we can't do it alone. We can't, source all of our own technologies alone. We need to think about ways to strategically do this with partners. There's actually a great op-ed on this in the Washington Post, I think, today, if anyone saw it, on sort of that industrial policy needs allies, right? We shouldn't just be this sort of go it alone approach, because we are all interconnected. These technologies have global supply chains. Decoupling slows down our ability to respond to climate change, beyond the sort of broader political tensions it's of course going to create. So yes, I think that, we need to think, I think U.S. policy needs to think more strategically about how do we bring the developing world along, not just, the U.S. along, right? Because the capacity that we have in these areas. And again, it's not just in the manufacturing, right? It's in the deployment of these technologies, which happens locally, right? And the installations and all this. And there's just so many innovative business models. Again, not just in renewables, which we're talking about, but in energy efficiency, energy service providing, right? There's just so much that has to happen and be scaled very quickly at scale, particularly in the industrial sector, the building sector, right? China, again, is sort of core to piloting a lot of these technologies. And so I think we need to think of how do we not just go it alone, but we sort of bring the rest of the world along and maintain sort of the political, ability to get local benefit from this that allows everyone to sort of stay at the
How about, I'd like to open up to the audience, you guys that's in the room and also virtually. If Jennifer, if you want to let me know if anyone asked something. And if you have a question, then grab the little microphone, press the button, say who you are real quick, and let's do some quick round of succinct questions.
Yeah, I'm Chris McRae. So the last real meeting I attended 3 years ago, actually Joseph and I were speaking, and I asked him, are we ever going to get to the deep data collaborations needed for the SDGs? And he took climate as the case in point and basically said, unless we agree that we need to sort of power with people rather than power over people on climate, then we're all cooked. So where this moves me to, 3 years on, I'm wondering, there are some very specific deep learning artificial intelligence methods, which are different from all the other stuff, which have been advancing on the climate side. So you maybe know that Susan Athey from Stanford has actually been seconded, I believe, to part of Biden's carbon zero market specification. And carbon zero markets seem to be about data being included. But the other case, which I'd really like your view on, is DeepMind has opened up this database of 200,000 proteins. Basically, biotech has leaped forward millions and millions of man-years' work on that side of things. Now, is there a relationship between biotech moving forward and climate tech moving forward? As one example, some of these proteins can be used to start eating up plastic in seawater and so cleaning things. But I don't know where this all comes to, because there are many different sciences that come together. So I'd love for your view on that.
I'm happy to answer, but Erica might be best.
Erica, it seems like this is your space. Miss business tech innovation woman.
I guess my answer is, I hope that it's used for the powers of good in climate, and I think there's certainly potential to have a lot of benefits. But to be honest, I've not been focused on specifically how it's being used and what its potentials are at this time. I will certainly be looking into it a little bit more, because I do think it is an area that has vast potential, but it's not one that my organization has been looking at, and maybe not enough, right? And it's maybe an area that we should break out, because we have it's an AI committee, and then we have a climate committee that we work on with and maybe those need to be combined, right? But it's I think everyone's trying to get on top of AI at the moment, and maybe it's not. Climate hasn't, in the conversations within our organization, has not yet been a primary focus of that group, but I will go back and suggest that we follow up on that, and hopefully by next time have some better clarity.
I
I was
can
just
just
wondering
add-
about
yeah.
database scientists, because you did mention you'd collected a large database for your book. And so,
Turn it on if you're going to.
No, thank you for the question. I mean, I think that this is, again, as Erica said, something everyone is still just sort of starting to figure out. But I have some research right now where we're actually looking at sort of how different AI tools and methods are being applied to climate-related research around the world, and who is sort of leading and what are the key areas. And, we find that maybe not surprisingly, China is sort of leading in the application of AI to climate. We do a sort of a bibliometric analysis of research of papers that are coming out that sort of are at the intersection of climate and AI. And, you see it being used in a variety of areas, from climate modeling, to kind of get better modeling predictions, renewable energy predictions, and sort of ways to do that. So there's a lot of different applications of different AI-related tools, from machine learning to others, that I think are very exciting, but as Erica said, I think there's obviously there's sensitivities and sort of around anything that involves sort of large amounts of data, particularly if anything with international collaboration, using satellites, et cetera. So that has to be sort of worked out. I mean, even like renewable energy resource data can have political sensitivities, as we know, but you have to have good data to sort of, be able to apply the analytic tools. So I think, could be exciting opportunities.
All right, we're going to pick up 2 questions on this side of the table and then 2 remote ones. So how about you, sir? And
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Joanna, for your excellent talk. And you just make an excellent advertisement for your new book. Thank you. And I'm glad that yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned CERC, and you mentioned S&T agreement between China and the U.S., right? And I have tons of questions to discuss with you, but I'll choose a small one. Yeah, do you think that the climate S&T cooperation between U.S. and China, the main obstacle is the IP issue? Do you think so? And if yes, can you dive a little bit deeper to this issue, and how do we solve it? That is my question. Thank you.
okay, and then we'll get Jeremy a question, and you can answer them together. Jeremy? And say who you are and what you, yeah.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jeremy Schreifels. First of all, Joanna, thank you very much for putting this kind of structured exploration of these agreements together. There are a lot of really useful insights that I think will be useful for policymakers going forward. I want to expand a bit on the question that Jennifer asked. And, thinking about the kind of old model where countries were providing capacity building and information to China, and then that kind of evolved where it was more of a partnership, and information flowed both ways. And then you detailed the case study between China and Brazil, where China was in that role of providing capacity building and information sharing. Do you see, beyond purely commercial activities, do you see more opportunity for that? Is that the way that China is transitioning? And then are there opportunities for multilateral collaboration in those kind of frameworks.
Thanks there, Jeremy. Do you want to 2 against 1 ping pong there?
Sure. That second one,
Yep.
too. Thank you for the great questions. I mean, on the first question about is the IP issue the main obstacle to climate and energy cooperation? I think actually no, not right now. I think in the past it has been a big issue, but I think, IP takes a lot of forms, right? And sort of the value in technologies takes a lot of forms. And I think right now, the main obstacles are actually just about this sort of broader feeling of sort of who benefits from the climate transition. It's really this sort of industrial policy discussion happening about, where manufacturing should happen, where the jobs should be based, should we have this sort of globally integrated supply chain or not? And again, it's really these sort of the political and economic tensions combined with, with some sort of security overlaid on that, although I think that's somewhat overblown in a lot of the sort of the S&T areas that we used to cooperate in. So, I think it's not that IP is unimportant now, but I don't see, I think we've actually made a lot of progress. And as was mentioned with the sort of new model, it used to be, oh, China's going to steal our IP. We're worried about this. I think Chinese companies are now very worried about their own IP and how they're going to protect that as they move into other emerging markets. I mean, I was in a dialogue where, several Chinese solar companies were being asked, sort of why aren't you bringing more capacity to, countries in Africa, for example, and they had real concerns about the sort of the market environment and the IP protection sort of within some of the emerging markets. So, and then, to Jeremy's question, I think yes, there's definitely more opportunity for China to take the lead. I'm actually interested in what Shuang and others maybe think about this. I think the Brazil case, I pulled it out because it is the sort of novel model, right, where China kind of brings a novel technological invention sort of to another sort of southern market context. And I mean, it was in part commercially driven, but it was really a research, driven activity as well. So I think there's still a lot that has to be sorted out about how we sort of do these partnerships so that there is this kind of win-win, right? That, in part the IP is protected, but also that there's sort of an ability for these projects to, I think it's just very hard these days to get the governmental approvals, right, to kind of take one technology from one country, demonstrate it in another country, and then bring it back, even if that's sort of from a purely academic innovation perspective, like what we would look at as sort of the optimal way to deploy a technology at scale as quickly as possible. You would sort of pull from whoever has the best ability to demonstrate, or to scale or whatever, right? But we know in the world we live in, it's you have to actually sort of superimpose the geopolitical on top of the technical, and that's just what makes it more complicated.
Liu Shuang?
Yeah, maybe to Jeremy's question. Well, firstly, thanks for drawing a distinction between the commercial versus the others, and kind of circling back to Jennifer's early question. Not necessarily, but U.S.-China competition on the local RE manufacturing capacity. I do think when we're talking about, particularly about overseas investment, there isn't one player that's called China for the overseas renewable energy investment, including the manufacturing capacity. So at WI, jointly with the Boston University, the Inter-America Dialogue, and Johns Hopkins, we actually host a database called China's Overseas Financing Inventory. So we've been tracking the investment made by the Chinese stakeholders, and the majority of the overseas renewable energy investment made by the Chinese investors are private ones. So there is a difference between the nature of the commercial activity versus the others. So I do want to share this nuance, because when we're talking about the competition, it's not necessarily the competition between nations. It's also the competition among commercial players, looking at how they can offer and also win better opportunities in overseas opportunities. And to Jeremy's question, I do think that there's probably not a clear line between the commercial versus the others on renewable energy particularly. I do think that looking at the scale of renewable energy investment we're looking at in many developing countries, there's no way that either only public investors or commercial and private investors can fill in the gap. So that's where, for instance, we're looking at some of the policy tools that can be set up by the public money to engage and mobilize private investors. For instance, there are many of the de-risking mechanisms we're talking about, or the other credit enhancement mechanisms. We've seen actually it is actually very much many of them are conducted by a multilateral approach. For instance, there are those de-risking mechanisms set up at the multilateral development banks or the regional development banks. But the intention of setting up those de-risking mechanisms is to help with private investors who are interested in those opportunities but perceived high risks that they're not willing to invest at the first place. So I think it's actually a hybrid of the multilateral approach engaging private and commercial-driven market players to meet the gap.
And China will play a big role in that, you think? Okay. Erica, anything you wanted to toss into the hopper here, or you're cool? She's good. All right. And I meant to, I forgot to note that those many people out on Zoom land. If you do have questions, there's a little widget underneath. And Jennifer, you have a couple questions out there. Can you let us know what they are?
So one of the questions is from Weila Gong, postdoc research fellow at Harvard. So she has a question for all the panelists, but particularly for Shuang, in relation to the U.S.-China cooperation on climate change. Do you think that the finance sector can be better insulated from the political intentions of China-U.S. collaboration compared to the technological cooperation sector? And then the second question, again, I think to all the panelists from John Marks, is to please describe the Track 2 landscape between the United States and China.
Thank you so much. Okay. Yeah, just start, yeah. Take the first one, yeah.
I'll try to take the first one. I'm trying to be very optimistic here, but I do think that the nature of the financial market, that how much that's connected, makes it very difficult to actually not to collaborate with each other. Two examples I'd like to share on the US and China collaboration on the sustainable finance work. One is that under the G20, again, a multilateral framework where that is combined with bilateral collaboration. The US and China, that's the Treasury and in the US and the People's Bank of China, that's the central bank in China, are co-chairing a working group on the sustainable finance. The list of the topics they're trying to cover under the G20 sustainable finance working group is so intense. And we do see actually progress were made under the co-chairmanship between US and China on it. So hopefully that we'll be able to see more concrete outcome out of that working group. The other part is that, for instance, last year, the SEC, the financial regulator here, launched a call for, a draft for consultation on the information disclosure of the listed companies here in the US. In China, there are similar initiatives that's under the State Exchange Regulatory Commission, which is a financial regulators too. We're comparing those similar initiatives. I will be surprised if that they are not looking at each other on what they are doing, because there will be U.S. companies who want to take the market in China and vice versa. So I do think because of how that the nature of those capital flows in and out from each of the countries, it will be very difficult to imagine a world where that financial regulators and the financial market are not willing and looking at how they can work with each other.
Great. Joanna or Erica, do you have something? Track 2 landscape?
So I'll take the question about the Track 2 landscape. I mean, specifically speaking to the climate and energy space, I can't speak to every aspect of that. But I mean, I have to say, I just in the last month or so, I've been at multiple in-person Track 2 U.S.-China climate dialogues and have been just so surprised, inspired, relieved at how well they went, how constructive the conversations were, how happy people were to be back together again. You know, this is, as many of you know, I mean, for those of us who've been working in this space for a long time, and, you know, often when I have gone to track twos that cover more than just climate change, cover sort of all aspects of the climate relationship, the climate people around the table often have known each other, right, for a long time from the US and China. It's still a relatively small field. And so many of us have long relationships, and, you know, I think have this built up, you know, many years of trust and understanding that even though we all recognize sort of the difficult political times, and, you know, I think coming out of the pandemic, we're just really feeling some relief to be able to have this face-to-face engagement, be able to ask each other like real questions to try to get to the bottom of misunderstandings, I think in many ways misperceptions, you know, if sort of all we are reading about each other are the newspapers and the sort of, you know, that really, I think, you know, there's some business in kind of making everything seem a little worse than it is. I am just very relieved that we've been able to have a lot of constructive track 2 dialogues. That said, I do think that the track 1 signals are still very important, you know, even at the researcher level, the company level. So I do hope that more can happen at the track 1 level. I think, you know, of course, Secretary Blinken's visit is a very positive first step. I hope that that Special Envoy Kerry and Xie can meet sooner rather than later, and as they've said that they are, you know, planning to try to, you know, reinstigate the U.S.-China Climate Working Group. And again, it's not so much that working group can sort of solve all of our issues, but I think it just sends a very important signal to all the cooperation that is still quite robust happening between our two countries, particularly, you know, I can speak to the research space, but I think also, you know, among other sort of NGOs and think tanks and stakeholders, which, you know, again, is just so important because it does, I think, it's sort of the underlying relationships that will sort of keep things, you know, keep things going.
I'd like to jump in, go back to the subnational question and kind of what it means, you know, and also what it means maybe for businesses. I mean, California, keep signing MOUs with China, and I think that there are delegations. I know that a bunch of provincial folks showed up in California, and you were just in California, right? That's where you're meeting all these track 2 people. But maybe Erica, what do you, from where you sit, from the business aspect, is there like subnational kind of climate cooperation? Does that hold significance for companies as well?
I mean, I would say that our companies are watching the China space incredibly carefully. I mean, China is too large of a market and already so incorporated in global supply chains that it's not in anyone's interest from a business standpoint to not figure out a way to lessen tensions and have things in a kind of lowering tensions and abilities to address issues head on, right? So there are challenges and there are issues, no question about it. And it's certainly a challenging environment, but I think from a business perspective, it's to find that balance between competition, cooperation, and when needed, maybe some political pressure and engagement, right, to try to figure out how to keep markets functioning and find those win-win opportunities, protect the IPR, protect the people for sure, engaging on both sides. But I will go back to say that when talking about track 2 and the multilateral framework, I think, you know, when tensions are incredibly high and it seems like, you know, dialogue is almost stopping at the bilateral level, which hopefully things are turning around based on this past weekend. But, you know, that's when those relationships at the end of the day are the only hope to kind of turn things around in the future. So maintaining those key, now might be the most important time. You always want them going, but to make sure those track 2 and track 1.5 and the multilateral discussions are continuing so that everything isn't lost if there is that ability to start finding areas of collaboration. So, and I'll just say, well, having watched there was a low point. I talked about the high points, but I did mention that the S&T cooperation were kind of consistent in an up and down relationship. So that relationship has had lots of up and downs, and I did start working in China right after Copenhagen, which was definitely a low point in the climate space between the U.S. and China. And I will say what changed that dynamic, right? Because I was there for all of the negotiations post-Copenhagen leading up to the Paris Agreement in 2015. And it was that personal relationship, I'd say, between Todd Shea and, Todd Stern, I just mixed them. Todd Stern on the U.S. side, the U.S. climate envoy, and Xie Zhenhua on the, it's a new term, on the Chinese side, that the hours and hours where it started off so tense following that, there was a lot of U.S. pressure for China to come to an agreement in Copenhagen with the implicit kind of indication that the U.S. was going to be able to pass climate legislation, which we did not. And then following on that, it was really bad in the beginning, but those initial talks, super tense. And then as that relationship evolved between Todd and Xie, it was like the respect and trust continued to grow, and they were meeting so often. And then it became, and I always point to two kind of, I think, big turning points early on, was not in the negotiating room, but was actually, one was on a trip to Tianjin with Todd and Xie Zhenhua, where Xie Zhenhua took Todd to Tianjin on the high-speed rail, and they had meals. And then when we went back into the negotiating room, tensions kind of decreased. And then they went to a baseball game when they were in the U.S. And I honestly think those were two of the things that helped enable the conversations to turn around, right? So the track 2 and these multilateral, continuing those discussions so that there's positive collaboration where there can be, is really important.
So baseball and Tianjin Baozi also played a role. I have to interject a question. I have a new project that we've been working on since September about U.S.-China, kind of cultivating a new area of U.S.-China climate work around climate and food. And at the last COP, food, not just eat, food was there. Because, greenhouse gas emissions from food, from farm, all the way down to waste is 31%, folks. And a lot of those are methane. I was kind of curious, crystal ball time. Joanna, do you think that, do you see this is an area where there's, we export a lot of ag products to China. It's not necessarily a head-on competition type sector. Any thoughts about, is there promise that could ag be a good area to explore?
Well, you're much more of an expert than I am, but I think anywhere where you can sort of find common ground, common interest, and sort of less, sensitivity worth exploring. I'm not going to comment on the food at the COP, which is always very bad, actually. I'm just kidding.
But discussions on food.
So I think we need more of that. No, I think, particularly, it spills into climate, as you already mentioned, with sort of the methane related and other non-CO2 issues. And then there's the sort of food safety issues. It spills into the public health realm, which is another very important and robust area for cooperation. So I think it makes a lot of sense in that way.
Okay, we get in on a high note because it's 11 o'clock and I want to be good to all the people.
Can I say one more thing really quickly? If we're ending, I just wanted to really briefly thank Jennifer and the China Environment Forum and the Wilson Center. I met Jennifer when I was a student, just starting to study these issues, and over the years, supported many of my students in this area. So I just want to thank you for creating this space for us all to learn about China and for US and China to engage. I think it's just very unique, valuable. You had a lot of foresight, and thank you for doing that.
Thank you. And so she wrapped it up for us. So applause, and thank you all of you for tuning in. And you can find this will be on YouTube later.